Uscinski with us. Did I pronounce your name right, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, good, because I've heard it pronounced differently before. I'm sure you have too.
Well, when I meet Polish people, they tell me that I'm wrong in how I pronounce it. So
Really?
yeah, they say Uchensky and I say Uzinski. So
Oh, okay, so even I said it a little bit wrong with the Uscinski, right? That's the wrong Uchinski. Good. Well, that's great. So just as a little bit of a side note for you guys, you might find this funny. I've been toying with a new title for the podcast. Connected by Controversy is something I've used for many episodes, but I was talking with my wife, and she doesn't think it's quite as punchy. There's not much punch behind it, and so we started going back and forth the idea of evidence. And I thought, well, what about evidence front? Right, evidence front, like Eminence Front from the song The Who.
Oh, yeah.
And so I went with that for a while, but you know what the problem with that is?
it's old.
Well, yeah, maybe no one will
Copyrighted?
recognize it. But at the same time, every time I say it, then the song lyrics are stuck in my head. So I had to
Oh.
discard that. Yeah. Yeah, my wife wants evidence front, but I can't do it because all I keep singing is eminence front, eminence front, eminence front, and I can't even concentrate.
And we don't want to hear you sing, really.
No. So I'm going with something along the lines of what's your evidence around there? Because there's lots of other podcasts that have the word evidence, but those combinations of words aren't there. I don't
Well, that's
know.
nice. I think titling it with a question sort of invites people to come in.
Yeah, I would like to use what's your source, but there's someone who already has who's your source on there. So that's too close, and I wanted to have something no copyright infringement. Well, so let's get right to it then. So Dr. Joseph Uscinski is talking to us from Miami. He is a professor at the University of Miami down there, and he's written extensively on the history and political science of conspiracy theories. And so he actually spoke to us at Marshall a few months ago, and I didn't get a chance to meet him, but my colleague, former colleague, I would like to consider him still a colleague, Dr. Dan Holbrook, who's a professor emeritus in the history department at Marshall University, did get a chance to speak to him, and he's with us as well. So welcome, Joseph and Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, as I was saying before, Dan and I have been talking for years about this, and I have to say one of the ways in which I came about being interested in conspiracy theories was through naivete. I saw saw JFK when I was probably like 33 or 34. Didn't see it when it first came out. Just was babysitting my twin boys when they were babies. Had a lot of time to kill, and wasn't exactly persuaded by it, but was intrigued. And then I started talking to Dan about it a few years later, and he stopped me in my tracks and was basically kind of got me out of a cloud in my head. I wasn't really buying into it, right? But it was intriguing. And so Dan started to talk about the kinds of standards of looking at evidence and looking at conspiracism as a phenomenon. So that's why I think it's so important to have him on the program as well today. So thanks, Dan.
No, my pleasure.
And Joseph, so can you tell us about how your research is kind of different than what's already been written about before? Like you mentioned Hofstadter and other authors in your books, but can you talk about how it's different?
So when I got into studying this, it was around, I don't know, 15 years ago. And conspiracy theories weren't really as big a topic then as they are now. I mean, there was the birther thing, and there was sort of the aftermath of 9/11 trutherism that had sort of dissipated once Obama came to office. But it wasn't what it is now. And I think that's true for both journalism and scholars, is that there were some scholars paying attention, historians, scholars of literature, but it wasn't that much work by political scientists or psychologists. So I got into it around the time where I think a few psychologists and other political scientists started jumping in and saying, let's start measuring things with polls and doing experiments and whatnot. So that was a departure from most of what was already out there. So you take somebody like Hofstadter. I mean, he went and talked to people and sort of put in historical context things that were going on in the late 50s. Um, that's not what I do. I survey people and try to say what's going on in the country as a whole, and then relate whatever conspiracy theory beliefs they have to whatever characteristics those people have, and see what correlates with what. So that's sort of what I do different than what was going on before I and a few others got into it.
And go
Um,
ahead, Dan.
Can I ask what spurred your interest in the topic?
I was never really interested in doing it as a research topic. I mean, I saw JFK when it came out, and I'm like, wow, this is great, and it's probably true, or at least I wanted it to be true. But it was never an academic concern for me. I mean, my dissertation was on the media agenda and things that why is the media reporting certain stories and not others? So it wasn't really something I meant to get into. It's just a co-author of mine knocked on my door and said, "Hey, let's do this thing." And my first response was no.
Yeah.
I said, "No one cares about this. This isn't a thing. It's way off the beaten path of political science." And I said, "You're probably going to get me fired because we're going to be doing this thing that is really untested. Where this goes, we have no idea. And, even if we were able to publish it, it's not clear that there's going to be a research agenda out there of people going to be willing to cite it or do anything with it." So he twisted my arm for a few weeks, and eventually I said yes. So it turned out he was right and I was wrong. Lucky for me.
Yeah, good.
But
Good for him. Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm glad you did. It's interesting that you had that kind of commonality with JFK too. And as you mentioned in the book, then this is really that's like the main conspiracy theory that has kind of all the elements to it, and that probably more people believe in over time than other conspiracy theories. And it's such a he does it in such a convincing way, and he shows how important movies are too, not just pop culture in general, but movies can be really important for influencing people.
I mean, it seems to have had the exact opposite effect, I think, of what he wanted to happen. Um, in that, I mean, belief in JFK conspiracy theories have been coming down
Yeah.
in the last 30 years from their peak in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Um, so maybe that movie is somewhat responsible for it. But the interesting thing to me is that, like, at this point, I've seen the movie so many times because I show it in my conspiracy theory classes that it doesn't even stand on its own at this point. That's how bad it is once you
Yeah.
go back and watch it over and over and over and over again, you start to see that it's not internally consistent. And then on top of that, I mean, Oliver Stone said point blank, "I made a lot of this stuff up."
Yeah.
Right? Which sort of aggravates me now because he's done another movie and he's been interviewed about it a few times. And he calls this movie a documentary, but he's trying to say, oh, but there really was a conspiracy and a cover up. But if that is the case, then he wouldn't have had to make things up for his 1991 movie. The evidence would have been there,
Yeah.
right? And he could have just told the story. But if you're at the point where you're just making things up out of whole cloth, then the evidence really isn't there.
Right, and that goes to one of your arguments that's based on this big data set that you've looked at too, multiple types of data, um, and which struck me, which is that even though these films can be influential and the websites can be influential too to some people, that they don't really have enough of a broad appeal to change opinion on a measurable scale. Is that correct?
I mean, a lot of people are selecting in to what they want to watch, right? And then a lot of people filter out things they don't already agree with. So I get a lot of calls from journalists and they're like, "Oh my God, there's a new conspiracy theory on Twitter." And I say, "So what?" And they say, "Well, everyone's going to see it and everyone's going to believe it." And I say, "So did you see it?" And they say, "Yeah." And I say, "So you must believe it then."
Right.
And they say, "No." And I say, "Well, what's your superpower that the rest of us dupes don't have?"
Yeah.
And what they start to realize is that people seek out what they want to seek out. They tend to seek out things they already agree with. And when they see things they don't agree with, they just don't change their mind like a lemming, right? And that gets held up in the data in many different ways. And that a lot of these beliefs, they're not just going up, 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 up over time. Most of them are stable or decreasing. So it's just not really the case that people just see things and then believe it. We're not
Right.
just lemmings on Twitter that just access anything and then believe it all. It just doesn't work that way. And we know it doesn't work that way. But somehow when it comes to conspiracy theories, we say, oh my God, it's going to spread everywhere. But we don't talk about anything else like that, really.
But do you think that sort of collectively, the wide variety of conspiracist thinking in the culture makes it more likely that people are going to believe or will adopt that worldview, that is, and that they can shift from one specific conspiracy theory to another without sort of violating that worldview? Oh, damn it! Hold on.
It's all right. Yeah.
I don't know how to hang up. There, I did it. Okay. Sorry.
And
Not at all.
scene.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So I've been measuring just general conspiracy thinking, like getting under the hood, and I've been measuring that for about a decade, and that's flat in terms of its over time trajectory. So that's not going up. So to your point, I mean, what concerns me is people who have that style of thinking very strongly, because those are the people who adopt a lot of conspiracy theories, right? But the question to me then becomes is what's the value of each individual conspiracy theory belief then? Because we tend to focus on these things in a very episodic way. Oh, there's a new conspiracy theory that says this. There's a new conspiracy theory that says that. Well, a lot of those are just being adopted by people who just believe all sorts of conspiracy theories because that's what their underlying worldview is. So is adopting the new conspiracy theory really meaningful? And the answer to me would be no, not that much, because a lot of these people already believe the same stuff anyway. It's just a new form of the same thing. It's just an expression of who they are underneath.
And of course, you
ahead.
go into the political aspect of it too, because you can actually see how even, like you mentioned, Ben Bernanke, right? People, depending on who is in office at the time, they can feel differently about him.
Yeah, all sorts of things. I mean, people, we know this when the president, changes party. The people last week who said everything's going great, now this week say everything's terrible, but nothing's really changed.
Yeah.
Right? So there are all sorts of forces operating on us that we're not really conscious of. Like my favorite example of this is when Herman Cain was running for office in 2012. So his claim to fame at the time was that he had been a successful CEO of Godfather's Pizza. Now, during the time he was running in the Republican primary, Harvard happened to be doing a repeated brand study on people's like of the Godfather's Pizza brand. And they also knew the respondents' partisanship. And what they found over the course of the campaign was that Republicans started to like Godfather's Pizza more and Democrats started to like it less. Of course, it's the same pizza. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what party you belong to. But and it's not a conscious thing. But as people started to learn, Herman Cain, Godfather's Pizza, Republican, that was going to shift people's views in subtle ways. And that's always going on, right? Our the way we view the world, our dispositions are affecting all sorts of choices we make. And we're not always conscious of it.
Yeah. I have to say too that your concept of the conspiracy theories are for losers, and not in a pejorative way, but in just looking at this politically, if nothing else, or even class-wise, that's actually made me more empathetic on a personal level to people who express conspiracist thinking, because my inclination for a long time has been to try to push back on those things, or maybe even, you hear somebody saying something and you just, it kind of grinds my gears, right? But there's no reason to actually get mad about it, because in a way I don't come from their perspective, right? And so if somebody from another race or gender expresses conspiratorial thinking, I can think about it within that same lens, that it really comes from a perspective of losing something, that there is that the world is kind of against them. It's not really, it's not just conjured paranoia out of nowhere. It actually does come from their political or social situation.
Yeah, just like sports. I mean, who complains about the umpires and the referees, right?
Yeah.
It's rarely the winners.
Yeah.
The losers. So I mean, it's a very simple logic there. And then among the losing team, who's going to be most likely to think that things were rigged against them? It's going to be the people who already have a conspiratorial worldview.
Yeah.
So you could see this pendulum swing back and forth over time as power changes hands. The people in the out party have reason to be vigilant and vigorous, and uh, they're on the losing end of a power asymmetry. So to them, it's like we're being ruled by outsiders, people we don't like. They're probably up to no good. They're going to get us. We really have to push back. We're really incentivized to do so because of our lowly position. And on top of that, these folks don't want to lose. Who wants to look in a mirror and say, oh, we lost because our candidate wasn't that good, or we didn't get out the vote, or our messaging was terrible? Why do that when you could just say we were cheated?
Yeah, sure.
It's a nice way to solve your wounds. Like, oh, I really won, but if not for the cheating,
Yeah, and Dan and
then I
I've
wouldn't have
talked a lot
lost.
about Dan and I have talked a lot about the JBS, John Birch Society, and it occurs. I was wondering, well, what is it that? Why would the John Birch Society people, who are a lot of founders or rich men, right? Why would they be coming up with this stuff out of whole cloth? And then I realized, well, yeah, but if they're actually afraid of communism, then they would be afraid of becoming losers. Do you think that kind of plays into it too?
Well, yeah, I mean, threat matters, right? I mean, conspiracy theories at their core are political ideas about power and threat. Somebody's doing something bad and it's having some effect on us, or it had an effect on us, right? So if you feel threatened, then you turn to conspiracy theories. I mean, politicians are really good at this, right? When they get accused of something, some wrongdoing, what do? Oh, that's just a conspiracy to make me look bad. That's all planted evidence. That's not real.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a nice way to deflect in that sense.
Let me ask you a question. Because, when I initially thought about teaching the course 10 years ago, I guess now, I thought it was going to be a course in the history of irrational thinking in America. And it didn't take me very long, doing some reading and some research, to realize that far from being, the sort of minority irrational part of what I guess we can call American culture, conspiracism is a constant thread, really from the minute Europeans get to North America. I wish there was some work on Native American conspiracism, but I don't know of any, and I think it would be difficult to get to pre 17th century anyway. And so I was sort of searching for, in the multiple times I taught the course, some sort of explanation for why conspiracism is a constant. And my question is, to what extent, what do you think, to what extent is conspiracism an innately human characteristic? I know it's a broad question and maybe an unanswerable one, but
So you can go back in history. It's just the problem is in history then is that we're sort of looking at episodes. So what I can do now is I can poll the country, get a sample, and sort of estimate how many people believe what at what time, and is that going up or down over time. If you go back 100 years ago, the data sources we're using are very different, right? We're looking at things that were written in a newspaper, things said in a speech that was written down, correspondence that people had. So it's not representative in the way that a survey might be representative. So we can see these episodes, right? But we don't know how many believed it, who was acting in what way, because our view of the far past is always incomplete. So I am sort of guessing when I have to say this, so with that caveat in mind, that history's hard to judge. It seems to be a constant. Is it going up or down? I would say it's probably going down slowly over time. But again, people like myself who do public opinion polling have only been doing this for just a little over a decade. So once I'm pre-2012, I'm guessing, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my question was your thoughts on whether or not humans are innately conspiracist. That is, whether whatever your definition of human nature is, whether we have, what's the word? Whether we are predisposed, whether humans are predisposed to conspiracism.
That could be the case. It could be. I mean, there are arguments that it's an evolutionary trait, right? Like, it's probably good for people, a few thousand years ago, if you saw outsiders, to be suspicious of what their intentions were. One thing I would say is that people have this at very different levels. Some people have very high levels, some people have low levels of conspiracism. So it's not like everybody has the same level.
Right.
So in that sense, if it is inherited or genetic or part of human nature or something like that, I would say it's only the case in that we're predisposed to have it at least a little, but some people have it quite a bit.
Yeah.
Well, and that kind of ties in because Michael Shermer just came out with a new book on conspiracies that you're probably familiar with, right? And he's trying to make the case from a psychological perspective, that this is something that's innate, that it's like erring on the side of caution, that it would have been, if you heard a rustle in the bushes, if you're any species, you hear a rustle in the bushes, then you're just going to assume it could be something that could kill you. And so you try and get away. If not, you wouldn't be able to propagate the species. Do you have any sense about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to an extent. It's just that, again, people have varying levels of it, right?
Yeah.
And then even beyond that, people pick and choose, where they want to apply that style of thinking, right? Because it's not like everybody believed Bush blew up the Twin Towers in 9/11.
Yeah.
It was mostly Democrats. It's not like everyone believed Barack Obama faked his birth certificate. It was Republicans. So I think the answers that get us closer to why people believe these things have more to do with just our personal worldviews and the groups we belong to, and things like that.
Yeah, and that's measurable too. That's what's
Yeah,
so important about your
and I don't want to
data.
rule out anything that's
Yeah.
evolutionary or in human nature. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to do that, but I think once you start making these arguments about things like human nature or even cognitive traits and how people reason, you're always missing this connective tissue that gets you from whatever that is to a particular belief, right? Whereas I can say a Republican who's conspiracy minded is likely to believe Barack Obama faked his birth certificate because that's what their side believes, because leaders on their side hinted that this might be the case, right? Whereas someone just having high levels of patternicity in their thinking or something like that, that doesn't necessarily get you to a conspiracy theory. I could see patterns everywhere and have it get me to God or demons or elves or anything else. It doesn't necessarily do a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the context in which that predisposition exists matters, and one of the one of the arguments I guess I made in the class, if that's the right word, I'm not sure faculty are supposed to make their arguments clear up front, but as it evolved, was that at least in America, colonial and national alike, there's no social, cultural, political, or economic stability. There's no extended period of stability. And so we're constantly in a state as a society and as a culture of turmoil. I mean, and this goes right back to, when the first Europeans came here to live. There's really no period in which, just to pick one big topic, immigration wasn't a source of social anxiety, of social turmoil, of upheaval, of threat to status, and so forth. And so this sort of culture of turmoil, my argument, I guess, would be, is that it lends itself to the conspiracist predisposition.
I mean, it could, right? And it's so in that sense, we're talking about an interaction between two things, and I would say that's, that could very well be true. It's just when people make arguments to me like, oh, it's because of the way our system is, or because of the historical zeitgeist that's going on at any given time. That's tougher to make the argument for, because it's not like everyone's doing it, and then it's not like everyone's being pushed to the same beliefs in the same way at the same time. Whereas if it was these big structural historical forces, then we would all be buying into conspiracy theories, and probably the same ones. But instead, what we see is it's a lot of these individual level factors that seem to predict it, right? So my view is, even if things changed wildly on the ground, economically, socially, whatnot, the conspiracy minded are still going to be conspiracy minded, right? Maybe it might change a little bit. I mean, who knows? And maybe they would conspiracy theorize about different things, but I don't. I often get uncomfortable with arguments where it's like, well, it's because people are in a precarious economic position. I'm like, okay, that's going to have something to do with it, but people who are economically precarious, some are more conspiratorial than others, and ones who are very wealthy can be conspiracy theorists too.
Sure.
Well, I'm curious, especially that idea that it doesn't necessarily change because of these big phenomena. Like you talk about looking at the amount of patents, new patents that come out every year, as not being correlated with an increase in, the Luddite-driven kind of fear of the new, and that it just continues. Like this latest article you said, or one article I pop up and I just type your name in. It says, "Don't blame social media for conspiracy theories; they would still flourish without it." And that kind of ties in with your theory that things remain either a constant or they're actually going down ever since the 1960s, right?
I mean, I see this as a very people-oriented thing. And one thing I've been trying to do in the last few years is to try to turn the focus away from the theories themselves onto the people who are buying into them. It's not that I don't think the theories are interesting or have particular consequences. But I think the issue to me is that this is very much a people-centered problem. Now, one thing I will tell you, I mean, I've been looking at data from across countries in recent years, and it is the case. You brought up stability. I mean, countries that tend to be less stable seem to have more conspiracy theorizing. It's also the case that, and I'm going to have to push beyond my data a little bit, but people in places like Cuba and North Korea are seem to be, from what I can tell, fairly conspiratorial. Now, in the former case, where you simply have unstable countries, I mean, you could sort of say things are going on all the time, people can't explain them, it's going to make them uneasy, and it seems like conspiracy theories might help them navigate through that. Where you take closed societies like Cuba, North Korea, maybe Russia to some extent, I mean, there, if you're not believing the conspiracy theories, then you're the dupe, right?
Yeah.
So once you go into places like that, it sort of turns everything on its head, right? If you're the one believing the regime, then there's a problem with you.
Absolutely. Oh, great point. Definitely, because yeah, it's kind of like, well, you realize that the government is actually the one that's the problem, and it's a single party, centralized authority, and like in Cuba, the main newspapers like Granma and Bohemia, they use that as toilet paper because people understand that's coming straight from the mouth of the government. They don't trust it. If you were to trust it entirely, then it'd be like, where have you been living? How
Yeah.
can you explain yourself? Really, you're living in a bubble. The one of the points that you mentioned, especially in the beginning, you and your co-author, I should say too, is of American conspiracy theories, is that when you add it up, that most people in the country believe in some kind of conspiracy theory, right? Based on the polls.
Yeah, I mean, the more conspiracy theories we put on any given poll, the fewer and fewer people there are that don't believe any.
Hmm.
So if we put like 25 conspiracy theories on a poll, it's going to be 95% plus that buy into at least one, assuming
Ah,
we're not picking really fringe, weird things.
right.
Um, but here's the thing. I mean, just putting JFK on a poll, you're getting 55% buying in
Yeah.
still. So just holding a belief is most certainly a majority phenomena, if not, if not unanimous. So so to me, I think the coverage of it has to be very careful because it's saying, oh, conspiracy beliefs are becoming popular. It's like everyone believes in one. And a lot of time the coverage is the conspiracy theorists versus the rest of us. And no,
Mm,
there's no distinction in that sense, because if
mm.
conspiracy theorist just means anyone who believes any conspiracy theory, that's all of us, right? We all probably buy into one or a few, even if we're not fully aware of it.
I've been trying to
It's
search for one. I can't find one, but I trust your data though, because there's probably something in there, and I'm always on the lookout for it now.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. When I put papers under review, and a lot of my research now, I have dozens of conspiracy theories that I've polled on. I always get a reviewer or two back, and these are academics who say, "Well, this one isn't a conspiracy theory. This one's probably true, or this one
Mm,
over here, I think it's got a kernel of truth, so that one shouldn't count." So, so that's the thing. I can publish on things that are really outside of the ivory tower,
yeah.
right? If I do a poll on QAnon and publish it, then there's going to be no academic reviewers going to say, "Oh, well, this might be true." But but if you do things that might be more believed by the left or get into, the talking points of left-leaning media, all of a sudden, well, I don't think this one counts because they're more inclined towards it.
Well, you mentioned the example of Robert Reich, right? That he was confronted by a conspiracist who called him a communist, and then he turned around and had kind of a conspiracy theory as well that people might not consider to be a conspiracy theory.
Everybody does this.
Yeah.
Like my favorite example is Krugman,
Mm,
Paul
yeah.
Krugman of the New York Times, because he would when Bush was president, Krugman was pro conspiracy theory. He said, we've been saying all this stuff and they called us conspiracy theorists, but we're right all along. And the only reason Republicans are calling conspiracy theorists is because they're using that term to bully us. But as soon as Bush was out of power and Obama was in power, then all of a sudden he's throwing around the word conspiracy theorists to label the other side,
Yeah.
because their views are conspiracy theories, our views are conspiracy facts, right? And after going after um, Republicans who he called conspiracy theorists for the 8 years of the Obama presidency, as soon as Trump gets elected, he says, "Oh, it looks like the FBI was working with Putin to elect Trump." So now he's back on his own conspiracy theories again.
Yeah.
So um, Hillary Clinton makes a great example. She says, "Oh, elections aren't rigged." Anyone who says that is a conspiracy theorist, and conspiracy theorists should be barred from being president. What did she say after she lost? Trump's an illegitimate president. And what did she say just recently about 2020? On one side of her mouth, she said, um, under no circumstances should Joe Biden concede the election if he loses, because it probably would have been rigged against him by Trump. On the other side of her mouth, she said, all those Republicans denying the election results are crazy cult members.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
And,
So,
like way back when, I think when her husband was president, she talked about the vast right-wing conspiracy. I mean, those were her exact words that was, arrayed against them. So,
and she said, and she even brought that back up in 2016 when she was running again. Now, I don't want to say there's an equivalency between
No.
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump on this score, because, I mean, there's difference in magnitude between the two, how much they do it, how many conspiracy theories, how much it is a part of their persona. But it does sort of show that the word conspiracy theory has very malleable meaning.
Yeah.
Everybody sort of defines it kind of differently, and it's just sort of a gut feeling what counts and what doesn't. And of course, our beliefs are rarely conspiracy theories, as their beliefs are conspiracy theories.
Do you ask your students on a routine basis what conspiracy, whether they believe, and if so, what conspiracy theories they're adhering to?
They tend to be alien believers, if anything.
Mm.
Alien meaning ET rather than immigrants?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So occasionally I'll get a Bernie was cheated out of the 2016 nomination. But more than anything else, I see, oh, I believe in UFOs, and that seems to be the thing that students will express the most.
Yeah. That's not really a
Well,
conspiracy theory, though, is it?
well, that the government's covering it
Oh,
up.
that the government's covering up.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think I tend to have an effect on the students where they tend to give up a lot of their conspiracy theories. I mean, one of the things we do at the end of my class is have them make up a conspiracy theory out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
Oh man.
And then find evidence for it on the internet. And then they trade it with someone else, and then they have to debunk the other student's conspiracy theory. And what they learn is that anyone can make up anything.
Yeah.
You can find quote unquote evidence for any phony idea that could convince someone.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you can easily debunk a lot of these ideas too. So once you put that together, and if students are a little bit introspective, I think they often start giving up on a lot of ideas they might have held previously.
That's a really interesting exercise. I had my students do an analysis. I really didn't want to call it a debunking, but an analysis of an existing conspiracy theory rather than make up their own. And some of them did a really good job, and I just asked them to, talk about who was propagating it, or where it came from, and who was promoting it, who its audience was, or audiences were, and what the evidence was, and how good the evidence was. And I think some students, maybe this is just typical student behavior, didn't really do an in-depth job, but some students really resisted the inherent debunking of that process, and I was hopeful, I guess, at least the first couple of times I taught the class, that at the end of the class, more of the students in the class would do as your students do, that is, be less likely to believe in conspiracy theories. But I think, in fact, they might have gained a little bit of critical thinking skills, like really think about who's promoting them. But as far as disabusing them of conspiracy theories, at least as far as their hands going up when I ask who still believes in conspiracy theories, like everybody but me puts their hands up in class. So
Well, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead.
Joe, don't you talk about that in the book too? That really, that efforts to try and change people's minds on this don't really work, right? And that does show that kind of the consistency, especially because if they have political inclinations, then they're going to see things through that kind of prism.
I mean, it's hard to change minds. Now, keep in mind, like if students have a class with me, they're getting me for 45 hours.
Yeah.
Which, if we're going to try and change somebody's mind, we don't usually have 45 hours to spend with them over 15 weeks.
Right.
So, I mean, most efforts to change people's minds come down to sending a link or a tweet or a fact check or something at somebody and hoping that they just change their mind because you gave them, the right information. And I, I, I don't see that as very fruitful. I'm sure it changes the mind of people who aren't that invested in the first place.
Yeah.
But if a belief is an expression of something that's underneath, I mean, good luck. I mean, I of all people, I mean, this is what I do for a living. And I have family members who are conspiracy theorists. I can't change their minds, and I have plenty of time to do so. And they trust me, and we have a personal relationship. But I'm completely powerless.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as you mentioned, that there is an educational correlation there too, right? That it tends to be less, people tend to be less conspiratorial the more education they have.
Yeah,
So
but
in that
why?
respect,
But why
Dan
that is
was
we
making
don't
it.
know,
What's that?
right? So we don't know why that correlation exists.
Yeah.
So I would like to think as a educator that I teach people and then they rid themselves of their dubious beliefs because of my wonderful teaching. I
Yeah.
would like to think that,
Yeah.
but it could be the exact opposite. It could be more that institutions of higher education are pushing out uh, conspiracy theorists.
Mm.
I mean, if someone
Yeah.
wrote me and said, "Hey, I want to come do graduate work with you and figure out, how Bush blew up the Twin Towers," I'm not writing that person back.
Yeah.
And the same thing exists with income too. People who make more money tend to be less conspiracy minded. Could be because they're more comfortable because they have more money and they have, they're succeeding, so they don't have to say, "Oh, all these people are out to get me," because the
Yeah.
evidence seems to suggest the opposite. But it could be the other way around. If you are going to hire someone for a job that pays a high salary, are you going to hire a conspiracy theorist? If you're hiring a surgeon, are you going to hire someone who says first thing they say is, "Oh yeah, the medical industry is controlled by the Jews," or a stockbroker who says that? The markets are all rigged by the Jews or this one or that thing. You're not going to hire that person.
Yeah.
So in that sense, there's forces pushing them out as well. I don't think we fully understand why those correlations are there, but we do know they are there.
Yeah. Well, and that kind of brings me to something that isn't covered in American Conspiracy Theories, because that came out in 2014, right? And that is with the advent of QAnon and especially the increase of conspiratorial thinking, or at least what it seems like is an increase under Trump. There's this odd phenomenon where you have the Republican Party that wins the 2016 election, but there seems to be more conspiracism on that side. Can you talk about why that might be or what you think about that idea?
So Trump broke a lot of political science in some
Hmm.
ways, not completely, but there are certain major theories that we had that Trump sort of undermined. I mean, one of those was the idea that the party decides who gets nominations, because it's the endorsements, it's the money coming from elites that tends to drive this. And once partisan elites sort of coalesce around a candidate, that's what happens, and the people tend to follow along. Um, that didn't really happen in 2016 with Trump. It was much more bottom up driven. Um, Conspiracy theories are for losers took something of a hit. Because on the one hand, Trump won, yet he was still saying, "Oh, it was rigged against me,"
Yeah.
right? Um, and he continued, despite being the most powerful person in the world for 4 years, he continued saying that there were powerful forces out to get him, which is rare. Um, but here's what I would say is that the Democrats did become very conspiratorial. They have amnesia now and want to forget it, just like they got amnesia when Barack Obama got elected about everything they said about Bush for the previous 8 years.
Mm.
But they were quite conspiratorial about Donald Trump, his election, and everything he was doing. So, in that sense, the losers were conspiracy theorizing. They just don't want to admit it. And of course, their conspiracy theories, they say, aren't conspiracy theories at all. They're conspiracy facts or reasonable conjecture. Okay. Um, And when Trump did conspiracy theorize, often it was about things where he was either losing or under threat. So he didn't say the Electoral College was rigged. That was hunky dory. He said the popular vote was rigged because he lost that, right? So in a lot of ways, the idea that losers do this still sort of hung on. Now, the addition to that theory, which I think comes from the Trump years, is that Trump wasn't really a normal partisan politician. So my work in American conspiracy theories, all that data collection is from sort of regular partisan politicians acting like partisan politicians and using party cues and party issues to get partisans to come and vote for them. Trump didn't do that. I mean, Trump used anti-system rhetoric, conspiracy theories. He ran against both parties. So his goal wasn't just to out-Republican the other Republicans in the 2016 primary. It was to undermine the entire system. Like, hey, Jeb Bush, great job being a successful governor of Florida for 8 years, but that just means you're 8 years more corrupt than me.
Yeah.
Right? So everything got flipped on its head. So um, I think a lot of the Trump phenomena has to do not with him being a Republican. It has to do with him really not being that much of a Republican, him being an outsider to the system. And because he truly was an outsider, he could use that persona to his advantage and always claim that he was the victim of the deep state, of the Democrats, of these powerful forces that were out to get him, because it sort of made sense. He was always under threat.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, also gains at least the appearance of power by overcoming those forces that are arrayed against him.
Mm.
Sure. And,
Yeah.
and think about it this way. I mean, I don't think he convinced a lot of people to become conspiracy theorists. He activated those people who already had that mindset to join his coalition. Right? So in that sense, a lot of what's happening with him now is that he's simply preaching to the choir.
Mm.
That he's got these people and he's sort of stuck with them, so he has to keep playing the same act over and over again.
Yeah.
Because they won't let him do anything else. I mean, a good example of this is when he came out and said, I got vaccinated and you should probably get vaccinated too. Everyone boos him, even though those were his supporters. Why? Because that he recruited conspiracy-minded people who were very anti-vax and very different from other Republicans in that sense. And he can't change his tune now. This is who he is. So he's the Pied Piper of conspiracy-minded people. And just like a band that's been around for 50 years, he's got to come out and play the hits. He can't do the new album.
And I was wondering too, what you think about this idea, because I've thought about this only a little bit, and that is that first of all, that QAnon really started taking off more during the pandemic lockdown, right? Maybe
I wouldn't say that.
No.
In fact,
Okay.
I'd almost say the opposite. I mean, QAnon got a ton of attention in the pandemic, where the headlines were just sort of going bonkers. Say, oh my God, it's big and getting bigger and growing and this and that. And the claims that journalists were making sort of became trapped in their own echo chamber. Right. So it was just a handful of reporters all sort of putting out fantastic headlines and all sort of bouncing it back and forth. And when you measure this in sort of standard ways, are you a believer in QAnon? Are you a follower of QAnon? How much do you support the QAnon movement? It's flat and small. Wow. And for me, it was one of the least believed conspiracy theories that I polled on in the last 5 years. So it's just really not the case that it was big and getting bigger. And if we just think about it for a minute, it starts to become clear why. No one slips on a banana peel and winds up on 8chan.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, no one's buying into this stuff just merely by accident or because of incidental exposure. And I think where sometimes the reporting went wrong was that they were relying on data sources that were either anecdotal, like, oh, I went to a Trump rally and saw a bunch of people with Q shirts. Well, so what? That doesn't tell you the size of the movement nationwide or if it's big or getting bigger. And then looking at internet activity, which again isn't that great of a barometer of public opinion writ large.
Yeah.
And then the final thing is that a lot of the polls that got trotted out on QAnon they had the most fantastic results. And that's why they were making headlines. But generally, the polls with the most fantastic results are the least, the ones that have the most wrong with them. So there were double and triple barreled questions being asked of people. So they're getting huge numbers. And a lot of the questions they didn't even ask about QAnon specifically, but asked about other ideas like, oh, is there, government sex trafficking going on? Are there pedophiles in government? Things like that. And those ideas have been around forever, forever. And just to give you one example, you brought up the JFK movie. There you have pedophiles in the deep state working against the president. So this sort of idea of QAnon, you can see that long before QAnon showed up.
Yeah.
Right.
The last time I taught the class, we spent 2 weeks focusing on QAnon, and one of the things that I tried to point out is that there are no new ideas there. And in fact, you can go back to anti-papist conspiracy theories of the 17th century and find, or anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from the 14th century have the exact same elements: baby killing, blood drinking, sexual abuse of women and children. So I mean, it's a highly unoriginal conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason why it gets trotted out all the time is because the worst thing you can accuse people of.
Right.
Yeah.
It's irredeemable.
Right.
So, I mean, my concern, Mike, go ahead.
It's evil.
Yeah, it's evil. And my concern right now isn't so much with QAnon specifically, but with a lot of those accusations, right? Because I've been collecting the things that conservative pundits and politicians and pastors have been saying in the last year. And some people are calling what we've experienced over the summer a new satanic panic. And that you have people saying, oh, there's massive child grooming, there's all sorts of pedophilia going on, the LGBT community is all groomers. So these things are getting trudged up, but very few people are saying QAnon when they say it, right? They're just levying the accusations at people. And if you go and look through Marjorie Taylor Greene's Twitter account, for example, it's full of this stuff. Disney is pedophiles, Disney's groomers, the Democrats are groomers, Mitt Romney is a pedophile. I mean, so they're just throwing these accusations all over the place.
Yeah.
But none of it's new. It's just if you have a mindset that the out group is the most evil thing, well, this is what you accuse them of.
Right.
Yeah, gosh. And it's not, even though it's possibly going down over time, over the long scheme of time, that is, it's not innocuous, right? That's not the case you're trying to make.
No, I mean, I never say, oh, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
It's just I do get concerned with the alarmist claims.
Right.
Like, oh my God, social media is gonna destroy everything. And it's like, no, relax a little bit. Or conspiracy theories it's now more than ever. I'm like, no. It doesn't mean there's no dangers and no harms. And it doesn't mean they don't exist. They certainly exist. And they probably exist more than we may have previously thought. Right? I mean, think about who we are. I mean, we're hanging out in that ivory tower. We're separated from, the common folk. So we're not seeing all these beliefs that are out there. But then and for that reason, because we don't see it, we don't poll on it much, and we're not keeping track, and we don't think anyone really believes it. But in the last decade, as we have started polling on it and keeping track and seeing how widespread are these ideas, we're all scratching our heads saying, holy cow, I didn't see that coming. You know,
Yeah.
like this summer we ran polls on do you think that um, there's widespread satanic conspiracy to sexually or to ritually sexually abuse children? And this was debunked years ago during the '80s satanic panic. The FBI find no evidence of this.
Yeah.
We got a third of Americans saying they agree with that. And that's the thing is that we are sort of elites in that sense. You know, we are highly trained. I'm not going to say we're well paid because I don't want the dean to hear me say that.
Yeah. Right.
But we live sort of comfortable lives,
Sure.
and we're separated from a lot of from average folks. So we're not seeing these ideas.
Yeah.
But once we start searching for them, oftentimes we're surprised at just how prevalent they are.
The satanic panic is something that I think I was exposed to in the late '90s when friends of mine and the new acquaintances too started talking about how that had happened to them, and it just it shocked me. I didn't know that it was something that had been debunked, that had been written about before as well, and at first I believed that it was taking place to this one individual, and then I started to think about it. And well, it's just like with the 9/11 conspiracy theories. When you first learn about the possibility that it was a truck bomb at the Pentagon and still instead of the plane, you're intrigued. And then someone comes along and says, no, that's a conspiracy theory. Oh, okay, I understand. Um, but with this satanic panic, it's can you explain kind of how it has been debunked? I mean, this is, I haven't seen it written about extensively in many places. Lawrence Wright writes about it. There's a book called My Lie, also. I can't remember the author's name, where she writes about it too, and you mention it.
So in the '80s, I mean, there was a book that came out called Michelle Remembers, and then there were a
Mm,
bunch of sort of local panics where they said, "Oh, the daycares are doing satanic harms to the children, and they're doing widespread sex abuse and all sorts of rituals." And the spread everywhere.
yeah,
You know, so you had this popping up in Canada and the US and the UK, other countries, and there was a lot of trials held. And people went to jail, sometimes for decades. And they're all
yeah,
getting let out and paid millions of dollars because of the injustices that were done. And the FBI went in and studied all this. And they said, we have found no evidence of a widespread satanic conspiracy to do ritual sex abuse. The evidence just wasn't there. And they're very clear about it. I mean, yes, I mean, child abuse happens and sex abuse does happen, but not in the ritual satanic way that many of the theories were claiming.
yeah.
So, I mean, when I grew up, I thought it was real,
Mm,
right? Because there's, oh, that's Satanists in the woods. Watch out, they're going to get you, or something
yeah.
like that. But by the '90s, there just wasn't positive evidence of this. Um, Yet people continued to believe in it. I mean, and I think part of the reason with that has something to do with the media. I mean, they were very happy to do stories saying, "Oh my God, look at these alleged things going on at the McMartin preschool in California and
Yeah.
satanic practices harming children." Ah, but then once there's no evidence, they've moved on to the next story,
Do you
and that
remember?
doesn't get reported, right?
Yeah. Did you ever see the 1987 film with Dan Aykroyd, Dragnet?
Yes.
And did you ever associate those two?
Um, they are associated in a certain way, right? In which you
Yeah.
have the religious, in that movie, you have the religious right sort of trying to push back against what they call paganism. I
Yeah.
mean, the group they're fighting is called pagan,
Yeah.
who
And they're out in the
dressing up in
woods
horns and
and
furs and
scary.
doing all
Right.
sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I mean, that panic was real. It was a real part of the '80s culture, and then it just sort of died out, right?
Yeah.
And even just a few years ago, Texas let a couple out of prison for being wrongly convicted, and they had to give them millions of dollars for destroying their lives on insane accusations that never should
Yeah.
have even made it to court.
Right. Yeah.
I
So
mean,
Pizzagate isn't
it's
original in that sense.
Yeah.
the presence of Satan in conspiracy theories is, another long-term continuity. I mean, it's, I used a book in class once called Satan in America. I cannot remember the author's name at this point, but Satan is just an all-purpose villain. Useful regardless of I mean, even non-believers. Satan is a very useful character.
Yeah, and we've seen, so like Marjorie Taylor Greene, oh, it's satanic.
Right.
Well, not just to talk about, things she doesn't, well, she's using it to talk about all sorts of things she doesn't like, right? She's, oh, abortion. Well, that's Satan whispering in women's ears to tell them to get abortions. Even Tucker Carlson, who doesn't usually get into that sort of rhetoric, is saying, oh, well, if you're transgender, then that's satanic or something. So it's getting tossed around quite a bit. And it's exactly as you say. It's just a call out to the worst sort of evil we can imagine.
Wow. And so what are you working on now?
So mostly satanic panic things right
Oh,
now.
good.
And then once I get that out the door, I've started working on the psychological and political underpinnings of belief in the white replacement conspiracy theory. So the idea that whites are being systematically eliminated in favor of cheaper non-white workers.
Right. That goes back to that the kind of the crises, right? That or the what was the term you used, Dan?
Turmoil.
Turmoil. Yeah. Right. With immigration, definitely. Well, I wanted to see if there's anything else either one of you wanted to say or ask before I close up in the next few minutes.
Well, I've got a million questions, but
Pick one. Yeah.
An hour might be enough for any sane person to listen to this.
No, I think people would be interested to listen more about this as well, because this is something, as you mentioned, most people do believe in at least one of these, and I know if someone was talking to myself and when I was 22, I don't think I believed in any at the time because I just hadn't been exposed to that much, but
Yeah.
then as I got older and started listening more and more to people, especially, I'll tell you, the first time I really started to wonder about this is when a friend of mine challenged me on the Gulf of Tonkin, and I just dismissed it. They said, "Oh, the Gulf of Tonkin, didn't really happen. That led us into Vietnam," and I couldn't believe it. I was in the Marines at the time too, but then I thought, well, wait a minute, if that's true, then and of course, true in that context is very fuzzy too. Because there was some kind of an attack on the second and not on the fourth and all that, then it makes you kind of open to other possibilities. But then if you have a mindset that says, I'm going to critically think about this and I'm going to evaluate evidence and blah, 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 then you might be less inclined to believe any of these. So, yeah.
Among my earliest really clear memories was the assassination of JFK. I mean, I was 8 years old. And in the aftermath of that, this is the mid to late 60s. I mean, one of the first, I guess, conspiracy theories that I really dug into was the Paul is dead conspiracy theory. And I mean, that was at its peak, that was a really complex, multifaceted, clues all over the place. And so, the sort of constancy of conspiracism. I mean, in my life, I mean, when I look back at it, like it's a pretty consistent presence from fairly early on. I mean, I'm not saying at 9 years old I was reading JFK conspiracies, but at 15 I certainly was. I mean, they were prominent. They were in the news. They were in Congress. It's 1972. Is it the second round of JFK assassination hearings? Is it 1972?
The late 70s, right?
Later 70s? Okay.
Yeah, the House Congressional.
Yeah.
That
was
on assassinations.
So I guess I do have one question, and maybe it's too broad a question to answer briefly, but what do you make of Michael Barkun's book, Culture of Conspiracy? A culture of conspiracy? That is, do you think we live in a culture of conspiracy?
Um, uh, well, when we poll across countries, I mean, every country does it to some extent, some more than others. I like to say that the United States is very exceptional in many ways, but our conspiracy theorizing isn't one of them. In that sense, we're kind of middling, and we're probably on par with other Western democracies like Germany and Italy and in the UK. Um, I don't know, because I would need to see that culture that has no conspiracy to be able to compare us, right?
Sure.
And maybe this gets back to your early question. I mean, is it just something that's sewn into human nature? Because if that's the case, then it's everywhere that humans are, and it's always going to be a part of everything we do. I mean, I don't say this enough, and perhaps I should. It says I don't come to this come to my work by saying, "Oh, these ideas are all false," right? They could be true. Better than 0% possibility that any of the conspiracy theories I study could be true. I'm more concerned with why people believe or not than stomping my foot and saying they're wrong. So what's wrong with them? I mean, there are powerful people in the world right now conspiring to do really bad things, and we
And
have to be on the lookout for this. So I don't want to live in a world without conspiracy theories. I don't think that would be a healthy world to be in.
Yeah.
So I mean, what I do isn't to denigrate any idea or anyone in particular. I think there are times when some ideas, are just out of whack with the available evidence and can have dangerous consequences.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we should be pushing back. But in general, um, part of living in a democratic society is being vigilant and knowing that there are sources of power and that power can be abused.
Yeah.
So to just write off every accusation as, oh, that's just kooky conspiracism, we should never do that.
Yeah. Uh, a healthy conspiracism is the foundation of Enlightenment thinking.
Yeah, but here's a question I've never been able to answer: is where does the healthy go into the unhealthy, right? Where's that
Yeah.
dividing line? And,
Right.
and I don't know. I don't think anyone's to answer that, but I think we know that there is a certain amount that's healthy, and then we can see the unhealthy amount. It's just, where is that gray area? Where do we draw the line? We
I'd
don't
be
know.
willing to draw a line where skepticism leads you to believe that there is no truth.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
that's a line that has been, transgressed a lot in the last 30 years.
Mm.
yeah, yeah. When people kind of give up hope on the ability to analyze the world in a realistic way. Um, yeah, and also, yeah, from what I've seen too, a lot of people who are conspiratorial minded um, don't want to engage with the system, don't trust the system to, in fact, think that it's not, even if they don't think it's demonic, they think that it's a raid against them, and so that prevents them from seeing things. Especially with history students, I think it's people can be inclined I shouldn't say especially with history students. I only have experience with history students, right? So we really need to make sure that they're not reading extra things into what the documents have to say, and kind of try and pull them back from the conspiratorial thinking has been one of my challenges.
I mean, some people have, I mean, a lot of people have a victimhood mentality.
Yeah.
Some of them because they actually are victims.
Yeah.
And it's completely understandable why they think the way they do. But there's a lot of people who aren't victims and who have done quite well,
Yeah.
but somehow think that they have been the victim of something,
Yeah.
Yeah.
when in fact, the evidence suggests they haven't been. And we always have to make that distinction, right? Because there have been groups in this country who've been treated very poorly. And in that sense, if they are afraid of that, then they probably have reason to be. Um, at the same time, there are groups who've done very well, and it's like if they're imagining some magic plot against them, it's just their imagination.
Sure. Sure. Well, and as you point out in the book, though, there are plausible explanations. There's data-driven explanation to this. One thing I should mention to listeners too is that this is one of the biggest data sets I've ever heard of before. 120,000 letters to the editor over the course of 120 years, right? And even though, as you say, most people believe in one of them, the percentage, the fraction of a percentage of the letters that you looked at that actually talk about conspiracy theories is very interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, I mean, I think this is an important point when it comes to the internet, because we know there's conspiracy theories on the internet, right? But it's not like everyone's going to the internet to get their conspiracy theories today. It's not
Yeah.
like you log onto Google and it's just like, which conspiracy theory do you want to look at now?
Mm.
I mean, you can find it if you seek it out, but
Yeah.
that's not the majority of what's out there. And it's not the majority of where internet traffic is going. I mean, the New York Times is in the top 10 most trafficked sites usually in the US, and InfoWars is like number 400.
Yeah.
So it's, it's there, but just because it's there doesn't mean anyone or everyone is looking at it or being convinced of anything.
Right. Well, thanks so much, both of you, for being with me today. I think we're going to stick with something along the lines of title of "What's Your Evidence?" Until I get tired of that one and change it. No, unless. Well, so anyway, thanks so much again for being on, Joseph Uscinski. I'm down in University of Miami, and Dr. Dan Holbrook in Huntington at home. And for those of you who are interested, go ahead and leave us a review and send me any questions as well. I'm at Marshall University. This is Dr. Chris White signing off.
Great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Uscinski.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Great seeing you again.
Pleasure. Nice seeing you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.